I almost didn't answer it. I was on the couch with a bowl of leftover butter chicken from the night before, half watching a hockey recap I'd already seen twice, and when I heard the knock, I thought it was the neighbor's kid again. He liked to knock on doors and run. Third time that week. But this knock was different. Slow. Deliberate. Like whoever was on the other side wasn't sure they should be there at all. I set the bowl on the coffee table, crossed the apartment, and looked through the peephole. For a second, I didn't recognize her. The light in the hallway is terrible. One of the bulbs has been out since February, and the building super has been looking into it for 3 months, so all I could make out was a woman, older, coat damp at the shoulders like she'd been walking in the rain. Then she shifted slightly, and I saw her face. It was Diane, not my ex-girlfriend, her mother. I stood there for a moment with my hand on the door handle and didn't move. Diane Walsh. I hadn't seen her since last April, at the going-away dinner Catherine had thrown for herself before she moved to Vancouver. I'd sat across from Diane that night, and we'd made small talk about the Senator's terrible season and whether the new light rail line downtown would actually open on schedule. Normal stuff. Easy stuff. The kind of conversation you have when everyone at the table is pretending things aren't as awkward as they are. That was 11 months ago. I opened the door. She looked exhausted. Not tired the way people look after a long day. Exhausted the way people look when they've been carrying something heavy for a very long time and they've just now set it down on the floor. Her hair was wet at the ends. She had a leather bag over one shoulder and she was holding her car keys so tightly, I could see the shape of them pressing into her palm. Diane, I said. Hi, Nathan. She said my name like an apology. I know I'm sorry. I didn't know where else to go. I made tea. It felt like the only thing I could do. I didn't know what else to offer someone who showed up at your door at 10:30 on a Wednesday night in late March, looking like the world had just ended quietly, without anyone else noticing. She sat at my kitchen table and held the mug with both hands, and I sat across from her and waited. I'd learned that from her, actually. When Catherine and I had been together, I used to talk too much when things were uncomfortable. Fill the silence with words that didn't mean anything. Diane had once said to me, we were doing dishes together. After Christmas dinner, Catherine had disappeared to call someone. She'd said, you don't have to say anything, Nathan. Sometimes people just need someone to sit with them. I'd never forgotten that. So I sat. She looked around my apartment the way people do when they're buying time. The print I had on the wall above the TV, a vintage map of Lake Superior my dad had given me. The stack of paperbacks on the windowsill. The dishes drying on the rack. You've made it nice, she said finally. This place. It's small. It's a home. She looked at the map. Richard used to love that lake. We drove up the North Shore once before Catherine was born. Stayed in this terrible little motel that smelled like pine and something that was maybe a raccoon. She smiled faintly. Best trip we ever took. Richard was her husband, Catherine's father. He died when Catherine was in her first year trip to Carleton. A heart attack, early 50s. Nobody saw it coming. I had never met him. Catherine rarely talked about him. What happened tonight? I asked. Diane set the mug down. She wrapped her fingers around it and stared at the table. Catherine called me this afternoon, she said, from Vancouver. She's engaged. I felt something move through me. Not pain, exactly. More like the feeling you get when a song comes on that you haven't heard in years and your body remembers it before your mind does. That's fast, I said. 8 months, Diane said. She met him in September. I nodded slowly. 8 months. Catherine and I had dated for 2.5 years. We'd talked about the future the way young people do when they're not quite ready to act on it. Maybe next year, maybe when things settle down, maybe when I figure out what I actually want. And then she'd figured it out. She'd wanted Vancouver. She'd wanted a fresh start. She'd wanted something I apparently wasn't. I'm not telling you this to hurt you, Diane said quickly. I know. I'm not sure why I called it good news when she told me. I said congratulations. I said I was happy for her. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for 2 hours. She looked up at me then. Her eyes were dry. She wasn't going to cry about this. I could tell. It wasn't that kind of evening. I don't know this man, she said. I've seen 3 photographs. He seems fine. He probably is fine. Catherine has good instincts about most things. A pause. Most things. I didn't say anything. I just kept thinking, she said, about the people she left behind, and I got in the car and I started driving, and I ended up here." She shook her head slightly, like she was surprised at herself. "I'm sorry. You must think I've lost my mind." "I don't think that," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "You were always kind to her, Nathan. I want you to know I saw that." I looked down at my own mug. "I know. She hurt you," she said. "She knows it too. She won't say it, but she does. It was a long time ago. A year isn't a long time." I didn't argue with her, because she was right. A year felt like both forever and yesterday, depending on when you caught me. She stayed for another hour and a half. We finished the tea. I found a tin of shortbread in the cupboard that my mom had sent at Christmas, and we ate half of it sitting there at the kitchen table while the rain picked up outside and turned the windows into gray blur. We talked about things that had nothing to do with Catherine, her book club. They'd fought bitterly about a novel she'd loved and everyone else had hated. Her sister in Fredericton, who was going through a messy separation, a documentary she'd watched about the cod fishery collapse that had genuinely kept her up at night. Diane was easy to talk to. I'd always liked that about her. When Catherine and I had been together, I'd sometimes wonder if I looked forward to family dinners more for Diane than for Catherine, which was a thought I never let myself finish. She asked about my work. I designed timber frame buildings, mostly residential, some small commercial. A couple in Almonte had just hired me for a barn-style workshop on their property, and I'd been excited about it in a way I hadn't been about a project in a while. She asked questions that showed she was actually listening. She wanted to know about the wood, about why timber frame, about whether I'd always wanted to do it. "My grandfather built his own house," I told her, "outside of Napanee. He didn't hire anyone, just him and two of his brothers in about 18 months. I used to spend summers there as a kid, and I'd run my hands along the beams and think, someone made this. Someone decided exactly where to cut and where to join, and it's been standing ever since." I paused. "I think I've been trying to do that ever since." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a beautiful reason to do anything." I looked at her across the table, and she was already looking at me, and for a second neither of us said anything, and it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the other kind. Then her phone buzzed on the table and she glanced at it, and whatever had been in that moment passed. "I should go," she said. "You drove here in the rain. I'll be fine. I know the roads, Diane." I said her name the same way she'd said mine at the door. Not quite a question, not quite a statement. "There's a hotel on Bank Street, a few blocks north. The Carmichael. It's decent, if the drive feels like too much." She looked at me for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes that I couldn't name. "I'll think about it," she said. She stood, gathered her coat from the hook by the door. I handed her bag to her and she took it, and then didn't immediately leave, just stood there in my doorway with the rain loud against the window at the end of the hall. "Thank you," she said, "for not making me feel stupid about coming here." "You're not stupid," I said. "You just needed somewhere to be for a while. That's allowed." She gave me a look I couldn't read. Then she left. I stood at the window and watched her headlights come on in the parking lot below. I watched her sit there for a minute, just sitting, engine running, before she finally backed out and turned toward Bank Street. I thought about calling someone. My friend Curtis, maybe, or my brother in Guelph. I thought about what I would even say. Catherine's engaged to someone in Vancouver, and her mother came to my apartment in the rain, and we ate Christmas shortbread and talked about timber framing, and I feel something I don't have a word for. I didn't call anyone. I put the mugs in the sink. I threw out the shortbread tin. I turned off the lights in the kitchen and stood in the dark living room and let myself feel the thing I'd been holding at arm's length all evening. It wasn't grief about Catherine. That surprised me. I'd expected the news about her engagement to land harder than it did, but sitting across from Diane all night, I kept noticing how little space Catherine occupied in the room. It was Diane who occupied the room, Diane's hands around the mug, Diane's voice when she talked about the lake, Diane's eyes in that moment before her phone buzzed. I went to bed and lay there for an hour and didn't sleep. She texted me 3 days later. "I went to the Carmichael. Just so you know, much better than the drive would have been." Di stared at it for longer than I needed to. Then I typed back, "Smart call. That place has good breakfast too." 3 dots appeared. Then, noted for next time, I set my phone face down on the desk and tried to go back to my drawings. The barn in Almonte, eastern white pine, Post and beam, traditional joinery. I'd been working on the corner details for a week. I picked the phone back up. Is there a next time? I typed. Then I deleted it. Then I typed it again. Then I deleted it again. I put the phone in my jacket pocket and went for a walk. It was April now, barely. The snowbanks on the side streets still gray and shrinking. The first brave crocuses coming up through someone's front garden on Flora Street. Ottawa in early spring. Ugly and hopeful at the same time. I walked for about 40 minutes. When I got back, I sat on the front steps of my building, even though it was still cold, and I sent the text. Is there a next time? This time I didn't delete it. The three dots appeared almost immediately. Then stopped. Then appeared again. I've been thinking about that, she wrote. Can I ask you something first? Yeah. Does this feel strange to you? Talking to me? I thought about the honest answer. I thought about the safe answer. They were different answers. It feels like the opposite of strange, I wrote. That's what makes it complicated. A long pause, longer than the others. I watched the dots appear and disappear twice. I know, she wrote finally. Me too. We met for coffee 2 weeks later, her idea. She'd suggested a place in Westboro, a small cafe she liked on Richmond Road, that roasted their own beans and had mismatched chairs and played jazz that was just quiet enough to talk over. I got there 5 minutes early and stood outside until I saw her coming down the sidewalk in a green jacket, and something in my chest did something I chose not to examine too closely. We stayed for 2.5 hours. We didn't talk about Catherine once. We talked about her work. She was a landscape architect, had her own small firm, mostly residential with some park design. She told me about a project she was finishing on the escarpment in Hamilton, a public garden that had taken 4 years to get approved, and she was determined to see planted before the season ended. She described the way she designed the sightlines so that wherever you stood, you could always see the water, and I leaned forward while she talked and forgot about my coffee going cold. She asked about the barn again. I showed her the drawings on my phone, rough sketches, the corner joinery, the roof line. She looked at them carefully, zoomed in, asked why I'd chosen that particular pitch for the roof. Snow load, I said. But also, I want it to look like it grew there, like it was always going to be that shape. She looked up from the phone and smiled. Not a polite smile. A real one, the kind that reaches people's eyes when they're not thinking about whether they're smiling. That's the hardest thing to do, she said. Make something look inevitable. Yeah, I said. It is. We were quiet for a moment. The jazz shifted into something slower. Nathan, she said. I know. I'm 53. I know. Catherine would. I know that too. She looked at me steadily and I looked at the table between us. The 2 coffee cups, the little ceramic sugar dish, the afternoon light coming in off the street. Then I looked at her. And I'm still here, I said. And I was here 2 weeks ago when you came to my door, and I've been looking for a reason not to feel what I feel, Diane, and I can't find one. I've looked. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I started to think I'd said too much, gone too fast, misread the whole thing. Then she said, I told my sister about you. I looked up. About meeting you for coffee, she said carefully. She asked who I was meeting. I said a friend. She asked what kind of friend. A pause. I didn't know what to say, and I realized that was its own answer. It wasn't simple. I want to be honest about that. There were conversations I hadn't expected to have. A long, hard phone call with Catherine in May. She was calm, and then she wasn't, and I listened and I didn't apologize for anything that didn't deserve an apology, and by the end of it, she said something I've thought about since. She deserves to be happy, Nathan. I just didn't think it would involve you. It wasn't said kindly, but under the unkindness there was something that might have been permission, or at least the beginning of it. There were moments when the age gap felt completely irrelevant, and moments when it felt like a fact I had to keep making peace with, not because it bothered me, but because I knew the world would occasionally make it their business. Someone said something at a work thing in June. A comment, a raised eyebrow. I let it go. Diane, when I told her about it, made a face and said, people have a lot of time on their hands. Then she went back to reading. I liked that she went back to reading. There were things about her life I had to learn to be part of. The rhythms of her work, the complicated geometry of her relationship with Catherine, the way she moved through the world with a kind of quiet authority that had nothing to do with being loud and everything to do with knowing herself. She'd lived more than I had. She'd built things I was still learning how to imagine. That didn't frighten me. It interested me in a way I couldn't manufacture and didn't want to. She came to the barn raising in Almonte in August. The clients had invited her. She'd ended up consulting on the landscaping around the property, which was its own story. And she stood in the framed-out structure, with sawdust on her boots, and looked up at the ridgeline and said nothing for a long time. "Well?" I finally said. She looked at me. The afternoon sun was coming in sideways through the open wall bays, and it caught her hair and the side of her face, and I thought, there it is. The thing I've been trying to build toward my whole life without knowing what it looked like. Inevitable. Like it was always going to be that shape. "You made it look like it grew here," she said. "That's the idea," I said. She took my hand. We stood there in the half-finished barn, with the fields going gold around us, and the maples just beginning to turn. And she held my hand in both of hers, the way she'd held that mug the first night at my kitchen table, like she was keeping something warm. I thought about the knock on the door, the peephole, the rain on her shoulders, the shortbread tin from my mom's Christmas package. How close I'd come to not answering it.